You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 12, The Harley Thing. I'm Bruce Philp. Thanks for listening. Well, some topics don't need much teasing to get people engaged, and I'll bet this is going to be one of them. We're going to talk about Harley Davidson and why this brand matters so much to so many people. And we're going to talk to somebody who's been close enough to the flame to have more than just an opinion about it. So stay tuned. I'm excited. At first, I want to acknowledge the promotional support of my friends at Eat Sleep Ride. The stories in these podcasts are about riders like you and me, and Eat Sleep Ride is a great place to meet them. You can discover this online community and magazine at eatsleepride.com. And as an avid user, I can also recommend that you download their free mobile app at your preferred app store. I don't ride without it. Thanks, guys. I also want to say thanks for the iTunes ratings and the emails that you've shared with me. They say the ratings mean a lot to helping people find this podcast. The emails really mean a lot to me. I also want to say thanks to the people who decided to give Noko Moto a try after the last episode. Days after it dropped, I got a note from Swiggy saying, "We've received emails from your fans telling us how they found us and giving us encouragement. You have excellent listeners." Well, I was pretty proud of that, so thank you. The subject of this episode is something I have always been curious about, namely the magnetic and sometimes polarizing charisma of Harley Davidson and its motorcycles. But the path that led me to the conversation you're about to hear was a little more twisted than that, so bear with me. This past May, the government of Saudi Arabia decided that women in that country would be allowed to drive. Well, this being a motorcycle podcast, I'm not going to dwell on the story behind that or on its politics. What matters here is that they couldn't, and now they can. The story was well covered in the media, but the article that stuck with me happened to be in the New York Times. And it stuck with me not because of the journalism, but because of a picture. There, under a headline that begins, "Saudi Women Can Drive," is a photograph of a young woman preparing to enjoy this newfound freedom by investing in some training. Except that she's not at the wheel of a car. Surrounded by teachers and fellow students, she's sitting on a Harley Davidson motorcycle. Well, it's a powerful image. There's always something inspiring about a woman riding a motorcycle, but this picture was on another level. There was something defiant about it that seemed to speak for everybody who's made this leap, regardless of what stood in their way. And even though there was nothing particularly Harley Davidson about the people or the situation in that photograph, there was still something pure Harley about the story that it told. Well, a few months went by, and I didn't give it much more thought. And then this August, Harley Davidson announced a series of new motorcycles that would take the brand to places it had never been before, most notably an adventure bike and a street fighter. Well, the internet, as they say, blew up, and commenters fell on either side of the old dividing line between the people who get and love the Harley brand and those who emphatically don't. On the one hand, as someone who's worked in marketing for a long time, this seemed to me like a pretty brave move for the motor company. Leaps like that don't always end well. But on the other, there is, again, still something distinctly Harley-Davidson about these new bikes, even though, again, their purpose and the people who will probably ride them don't conform to the usual Harley stereotypes. Regardless of whether you're a bar and shield person or not, you have to admire the power of a brand that can do that. A brand whose bikes still make a statement, no matter who rides them, or why, or where on earth they do it. So, if Harley-Davidson doesn't signify a certain kind of person, and it doesn't signify a certain kind of bike, and yet it can still arouse this passion in people, well, what does it signify? For a really good answer to this question, I figured I would need to get close to the source code, and our amazing community once again came through. You're about to meet Steve Piehl, who retired from Harley-Davidson 3 years ago, after a 35-year career in marketing there. From the last days of its troubled ownership by AMF to the birth of the Livewire, Steve has seen and certainly helped the motor company become what it is today, and he generously agreed to talk to me about that experience. I reached Steve at his home in Milwaukee, of course, fresh off the road from Sturgis. Hey, Steve, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm just fine, thank you very much. Thanks for speaking with me. I can't think of too many people more qualified to talk about this brand, or let's call it that for now anyway, unless their last names were Harley or Davidson. So it's great to have you. I guess I should start by saying, how was Sturgis?
So it was really great. The crowds they say were up this year, which is great news. But I think they were very spread out during the course of the week. There was action going on all over the place. And the best part about Sturgis is always the great riding, because, in the middle of the Great Plains, you've got this awesome place with mountains and great curvy roads and things like that. And I think that's the highlight for a lot of people from the middle part of the U.S. and Canada that come to Sturgis, is the awesome riding that you could do.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard it's worth going even when there's not a big bike week going on. Well, that's awesome. I'm glad you had a great time.
Quite frank. Yeah, for the riding part of it, I think that there's certainly less traffic when it's not bike week, and if you're just there for the riding, I tell you what, that's my highlight of the year in going to Sturgis, is getting on Iron Mountain Road, which is, they say it's a close competitor to the Tail of the Dragon.
Wow.
In Tennessee and North Carolina, and with curves and tunnels and great riding. So that, and then there's that and a ton of other roads that are just great to be on two wheels while you're riding.
That sounds awesome. My list gets longer even as my time grows shorter. Well, so why don't we start with your bona fides? Now, as I understand it, you just retired from Harley Davidson after 35 years, which, and I think I read a bit about, kind of what you're up to next, which we'll talk about later, but it sounds like you and I are in very similar places. So I'm excited to kind of hear your story. But to start us off, I'm curious to just have you share with my listeners what you've been doing for Harley Davidson for the last 35 years.
Sure. I had started at Harley Davidson right out of college in the fall of 1979, and I joined the company. My first business card said AMF Harley Davidson on it, and I started in the marketing department as a promotions guy, and so events and dealer promotions, things like that. A kid out of college who probably my main qualification beyond the degree was the fact that I was a motorcycle rider and never owned an automobile until a week before I started at Harley Davidson. And so my transportation life up to that point was my Honda 200 or the county buses in Milwaukee. And so I got in the door in what they say was a tough competition for a job, in part because I was a rider. And I did the promotions role for a few years, and it had some great highlights, like the first time any factory ever offered test rides on their motorcycles was when Harley Davidson did that at a rally in Ruidoso, New Mexico. At the time it was called the it was what was it called? It was in Ruidoso, New Mexico. I can't even remember the name of it, but it was one of the first touring rallies of that type. And Harley Davidson took the brand new Tour Glide motorcycle in 1980, the 80 model, to allow people to take a test ride. And so I worked on that. And then I had a tremendous opportunity a few years later when they grabbed me and at a time, very tough time for Harley Davidson. So early 80s, there was a recession going on. Mm-hmm. Sales of Harley Davidson motorcycles weren't very high at the time, and they were even lower during the course of that recession. And my boss came to me and said, "We have approval to start an organization for Harley Davidson owners, and it's going to be called the Harley Owners Group, or HOG, but we need somebody to put together the plan and the details. and we'd like you to do it. So as a relative kid, because I was 25 years old,
wow.
they gave me the keys to starting out Hog. And the keys were basically about a 3-inch thick ring binder with research and graphics, and a copy of the speech that had been already given to dealers, telling them that we were starting this owners club and that it was going to be called the Harley Owners Group. So, and basically my boss at the time said, it's a promotion. You should be happy. And this is a great opportunity. Here's the speech that I gave. Now you need to make this happen. And it's September, by the way. This has to be ready in place by January.
Oh, wow.
And so I've got I could probably write a book about just the following 4 to 6 months that it took to pull that organization together. But that was a pretty exciting time in my life and my career. So developed the Harley Owners Group, really the first of its kind factory-sponsored owners club, and ran the organization within Harley Davidson, along with some other aspects of marketing and communications at the time. And then I had an opportunity where leaders came to me and said, "We need your help in public relations, and we need to rebuild our PR efforts, especially as they relate to our motorcycle products, because our products have gotten much better with the introduction of the Evolution engine and some new frames and so forth, but we aren't getting attention by the media, and we need a refocus of that." So I spent a decade and a half in product and corporate communications efforts, and was involved in a lot of product introductions, everything from the first Fat Boy motorcycle to upgraded Softails to upgraded touring bikes, and a lot of features and new motors. I remember a lot of work around the introduction of the twin cam engine and communicating the benefits of that. And then during after that time in my career, I moved to being in charge of back to a consumer focus, which was around Harley Davidson events, and trying to re-energize and to put some focus around Harley Davidson events. And that grew to my favorite role of my whole career at Harley Davidson, which was where I was allowed to lead a team that was in charge of all of Harley Davidson's customer experience for North America. Oh, wow. And customer experience for Harley Davidson during that time was event marketing. It was racing. So I had an NHRA and a flat track team that I was responsible for. It was the Harley Davidson, which is now the Harley Davidson Riding Academy, the motorcycle rider training program, Harley Davidson rentals and tours, and the Harley Owners Group again. So I was able to kind of pull all of my loves of riding and working with customers and racing in a single role. And that was, I spent 5 or 6 years in that role, which was one of the highlights of my career, and had the opportunity to work on Project Livewire, the first electric bike. And, there's, a ton of stories that go with all of those different stops along the way. But that was, so I love Harley Davidson. I love what the motor company has been for me, for my family, and my kids grew up wrapped around Harley Davidson. And it's been wonderful. And led up to, a decision to retire 3 years ago in the middle of 2015. And at that point, my goal was to take on some projects where I could put a whole lot of passion into a project and manage the amount of time necessary. And I had just had my first grandchild, and I had the luxury of being able to retire at the time. And so it's like, so let me move on to that. And so that was about 3 years ago that I had that great blessing of being able to do that.
Yeah, that's a blessing. It is, and wow, what a career! I'm thinking maybe this should be a series, but
I got a lot of stories, Bruce. I can tell a lot of stories.
I have no doubt. Wow, so I have to think about that. So, I work in or have worked in marketing as well, so I have some kind of sympathy for what some of that job might have entailed. And one of the things that I was curious about was, working in roles like you've had for so long, you must have constantly been dealing with outsiders. So new staff, vendors of one kind or another, who you've had to explain Harley Davidson to. And so I'm curious to know, like, how did you explain Harley to people who were new to the brand? Without sort of giving away any family recipes, what were the things that were engraved in stone?
Yeah, well, I'll start out with, I mentioned earlier that during, my first motorcycle was a Honda CB200T, and loved that bike. And I had that bike all through college. And I worked with another, on campus with another guy who rode a Harley. And what I would tell people is the difference between he and I is he rides a Harley, he looks like Jesus, and he gets all the girls. And so that was my college summary. And when I applied at Harley Davidson, I would say that I didn't know a whole lot more than that about Harley Davidson motorcycles, but I knew I loved motorcycling. And I think, if you try to capture the essence of Harley Davidson in a single statement, that's almost impossible.
Right.
And what I did with, your example of suppliers, partners, and so forth, is really, there's so many elements of what drives Harley Davidson and really the customers' feelings about Harley Davidson that I always tried to break it down into what are the motivators, and why does your product or your service or your interaction with customers need to be special. And, and that goes to, things that we've probably all heard is that, this is not a product for people. It's not, for the most part, when people are choosing the brand of motorcycle they will buy, if someone is already a Harley Davidson owner, the statistics are overwhelming how frequent their next purchase will be a Harley Davidson. And and I almost hesitate to use the word lifestyle, because that's a changing environment, and that's a word that's packed with a lot of, maybe baggage, maybe just background. But I think that I talk about how much motorcycling means to that individual, and you can't even stereotype it as this is that this is the type of motorcycling that an individual does, because, for some, it's the passion of getting on a bike and going places they've never been. And for some, it's the escape of, this motorcycle's in the garage. And if I have a bad day at work, before I get home, before I go in the house, I jump on my bike and I ride for half an hour, and I clear my mind, and I can go in, and my family's happier and I'm happier. And, that's what it does for me. And it's almost a psychological lift that riding a Harley can provide. But for others, it's that ability to, there's people out there who customize motorcycles who never think of themselves as artists, yet they really are, because what they are doing, whether it's as simple as removing something that came from the factory to make it look different, to adding something that's special for them, that's a bit of personal artistry, in them. And there's, people who spend a whole lot of time cleaning their bikes because they want them to look perfect. And there's a whole lot of people who don't care how their bike looks because they just want to get on their bike and ride. And so there is no stereotypical, well, there are stereotypes, but there's no typical explanation for what motorcycling means to anyone. And that probably extends to many brands, but I think because Harley Davidson is such a big player, it stands out as one of those pieces that's critical to the Harley Davidson brand.
Right. Yeah, and with it seems to go a point of view somehow, if that makes sense. Like, I get that the brand is huge, and still to this day, 1 in 3 motorcycles in the U.S. Sold out of a dealership new is a Harley. But there still seems to be this coherent kind of way of looking at the world that you either have or you want to buy into. Which amazes me given the scale of it. So can you talk about the roots of all this? I mean, I think everybody thinks somehow they know the Harley story because it's legendary. I hate to use that word because it's been used so much, but it seems to fit. What's the origin story as Harley tells it? Like, where does all this begin?
I think that there's, when you look at, and there's been lots of books written about Harley Davidson history, so you can get a lot of the documentation. I think that the essence of Harley Davidson as it stands today is a post-World War II essence. It's the experience of, Harley Davidson talks a lot about it, and a lot of people who really dig into it is the soldiers that came back from World War II and fueled, a economic boom and fueled an attitudinal change in society that was driven by, there's a whole bunch of these young men who have been out there risking their lives to protect, democracy and freedom and all this. And now they've come back and, they lived a pretty risk-filled life when you're in trenches and tanks and, things like that, whether you were in the Pacific or European fronts. And and now you come back and I don't think anybody really wants to give up that type of excitement in their life. And Harley Davidson happened to be the predominant motorcycle that gave them that opportunity. And so along with the product changes that came in the 50s, came the attitudinal changes of the riders about looking for freedom, looking for excitement. And so that, although that hasn't been, the only way that Harley Davidson has grown and changed, I think the company embraces that grasp and pursuit of freedom, that originated really in those folks coming back from World War II.
That's really interesting. I would have bet that that Harley kind of turns a blind eye to that part of it because it gets all wrapped up in the myth of the Hollister riot, and that which really has been falsely reported, but it really represents the birth of the outlaw biker as a meme. And I was kind of half expecting to hear that Harley kind of pretends that didn't happen, but I think you're saying that part of the history, the true story, not the Hollister myth, is actually a big part of their culture. Is that a fair statement?
I think it is. And I think there was, Harley Davidson as a company has gone through, leadership changes and so there were times when, the company, worked very hard to separate itself from, that, 1% or bad guy, approach, things like that. But, I don't think it's been in the big picture, being a bit rebellious has been a good place to be for Harley Davidson. Mm-hmm. And because whether the company has embraced it or not, riders, to a great extent have embraced, rebellion, and rebellion, not in the thought of, we had a discussion once about what are you, it's like there's a biker movie line about what are you rebelling against? And we talked about what are you rebelling for?
Right.
And, we're and if you're in a point of rebelling for greater access to highways, I'm rebellious because I'm upset about safety of riders, as they go through towns and construction sites and things like that, that being a little bit different and challenging to the status quo has been a great place for Harley Davidson to be, even when the company was shying away from that but riders drove that piece of the brand. And in many cases, you could say the Harley Davidson brand is only partially controlled by the company.
Right.
That the brand is really dominated by the actions and attitudes of its customers. And I don't know that there's any other brand in the world that really has that type of scenario. Harley Davidson at their best can guide the brand, but ultimately the perception of Harley Davidson will be driven by those people who use the product, and along with the company that makes the product.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And it seems like, it's funny how everybody kind of instinctively knows that this is a brand where the people who ride the bikes and the bikes themselves are nearly inseparable from one another.
Yes, very much so. And you see it and I think part of that, the easiest example of that is apparel, tattoos, and places where bikes are ridden and riders hang out.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm just, I'm slightly in awe that Harley is so aware of it. Now your career at Harley spans nearly the entire, it spans nearly the entire post-AMF period, when it seems to me that Harley's focus began to kind of re-clarify, and it became the brand that we know today. So it became kind of more focused and more driven, and ultimately a ton more successful. I'm curious to know what it was like being there in those years. What about its culture drove that rebirth? Because what it went through then, it seems to me, could have crushed a lesser company's spirit.
So, and that's a great comment, and it involves. I think I was able to witness some of the best examples of leadership that anybody would be lucky to see or be part of. And I'll talk specifically about the beginning of Harley Davidson Motor Company as we know it now, because as it broke away from AMF, and there's a couple of leaders that I think are exemplary, in that process. So the first is when the company was separated, bought from AMF. The charge on that was led by an AMF executive, a gentleman named Vaughn Beals, who truly was a gentleman. I remember his kindness to me when I was a kid, barely out of college, and interaction and travel. And I remember my first time ever in an airline, hospitality club was when he invited me to go in there with him when we happened to be on the same flight. And who would ever think that the guy running a company like Harley Davidson would embrace the lowest level person in the organization and say, come on with me. But more importantly, with Vaughn, it was his leadership, first of all, in putting together the group of people that took the company private, the group of 13 investors, he being one of them. And then his ability to communicate the importance of the actions that were to be taken, and his ability to execute the changes that had to be made with a company that was highly leveraged, had very little cash, tough decisions to be made when you didn't have the money of a large company conglomerate like AMF at the time, and how he led, through a really process that said, we need to have better product. We need to be far more efficient. And so that work of beginning the process of developing the evolution engine, or you may say completing the process because things have been started earlier, as well as creating a far more efficient company, cost savings and really working through every penny. And I remember that here we were as a company and we're literally counting pennies and what we spend and how we use our money. But you went through that with an optimistic approach, saying, we're going to make it because things are tough now, but we're going to make it. and the small celebrations of, improvements in market share and improvements in quality metrics and things like that. So the first example of that kind of change is the organizational change led by Vaughn Beals and that movement away from AMF. And so heavy on manufacturing, quality and so forth there. And then another leader that came in after Vaughn was a guy named Richard Tierlink. And Mr. Tierlink, he drove the biggest cultural change within an organization that I've ever seen, because he drove it in with the message that people are our most significant asset that we have. And so he took a company, that had made it through the first few years of its separation from AMF based on saving money and based on trying to get more efficient, get better products out there, while staying close to its customers. And Mr. Tierlink focused his efforts on how do we as an organization keep the right people in the right places, make them feel how important they are to the organization, and then grow from there. So this culture of what that represents the importance of the individual that drove, and I think that culture of I mean something here, which is how Harley Davidson employees feel and felt it certainly at that time, was a driver for literally decades that was carried through the organization. So there's and those are just two examples of the kind of leadership that really, I believe, make the company what it is today.
Mm. Yeah, no doubt. And to be an employee in that environment, I mean, I guess it's self-evident that at that point the whole story is about independence, right? I mean, these guys have bought the company back at great, financial risk, and so the drive is almost existential. But the underlying motive is to be independent. Am I forcing that parallel to the brand, or do you think that's fair?
I think there's a definite carryover in that, and I think that so there's lessons learned when you're fighting for survival, that that you highly value that freedom and independence that you yourself as employees have been so much a part of.
Yeah, no doubt. So when we corresponded last week by email, I sent you a photo, and it was a picture of a young Saudi Arabian woman. And the story under the picture had to do with the fact that women had been granted the right to drive vehicles in that country. And she had chosen to celebrate that newfound right, not by getting behind the wheel of a car, but by sort of putting two fists in the wind, as it were. I think you liked that picture. What did it mean to you?
Oh, that was, Bruce, I thought that was just so cool. And what a great example, that we, after years of hearing messages about freedom, you think that they've all been used up. I've heard this before, but then you realize that in some cultures, in some countries, in some places, that there still is that fight for freedom and the fight for independence. And, the fact that, and I think that women especially look for opportunities to really make statements about themselves personally. And so that this Saudi woman who now gained that right, that freedom of the open road that we all love. And she, and it was, for the most part, it's people learning how to drive a car. And this woman said, I'm taking it farther, and I'm going to ride a motorcycle, and not just any motorcycle. It's going to be a Harley Davidson motorcycle.
Yeah, it was a Harley. Which Harley was it? I didn't recognize the bike at a glance.
So I think that was a Sportster, but I'm not sure. I can't. I looked at it the other day, and then I read the article, the New York Times article that went with it, and and I thought, and I believe she had a Sportster. But it was great that I looked at the other part of the picture too, was that she was surrounded by friends who were also on motorcycles, and it just reinforced that even though there's an individual statement of freedom, it usually comes wrapped in the friends that go along with the experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I think it was a school. So at least some of those people were students, and I just felt like I was right there. It was terrific. I'll obviously include a link to that.
Didn't you just want to be there when she? Didn't you just want to be there when she took her first ride? I wanted to be there to high five her.
I sure did. I sure did. Yeah, and I love those pink boots. I thought that was a nice touch as well. But,
pretty cool, right?
Pretty cool. So thinking about that moment for a minute, I mean, just as a bit of a left turn and kind of a strange question. I have only had one brief experience riding a Harley Davidson, which I'll come back to in a little while. But I'm curious to know from someone who has ridden them for so long and clearly loves them and clearly understands them. Tell me about riding a Harley Davidson. What makes it special?
So, wow, that's a tough question. So I'm going to break it into pieces because that's the way I attack problems. And so the first Harley I ever rode was a 1979 Sportster. And it was for a guy coming off his little Honda. It was a monster of a motorcycle, and it rumbled and shook. And, you had to hold on tight when you twisted the throttle because you pulled back away from the bars as you accelerated. And it was a beast, and it was so fun to ride. And I had, and after I rode that motorcycle, my first Harley was a 1980 Sportster. And that was, of that ilk, and I loved it. But it was one of those things. It was a time when the bikes weren't as reliable as I think Harley Davidson and everybody else would have wanted. So it was a burden of, I love to ride, and to do that, I need to do a little bit of repairs every once in a while. So that was first experience. Then have been lucky enough to have an opportunity to ride a lot of different Harley Davidson motorcycles. And those range from the new introduction of Softails to new touring bikes, even updates to Sportsters on racetracks and things like that. And I think that one of the pieces of that is that every Harley motorcycle that I've ridden has a personality. And not that every single one is unique, although they were kind of that way early on. But there's a personality to riding a Sportster. There's a personality to riding a Softail. And some of that comes with when you're on a badass looking motorcycle, you feel a little bit badass. And right. So that's kind of a fun, mental attitude to have on a certain bike. When I'm on a touring bike and I'm going on a long trip, like my trip to and from Sturgis, I'm seeking this wonderful experience across the plains and through the West. And, I want, some conveniences that allow me to do a 500 or 600 mile day. And so I choose the motorcycle that, gives me those conveniences. And so there's technical differences with a Harley Davidson, whether it's turn signals or feel of the motor, things like that. But I think that a first experience with a Harley is a special experience, and then the personality of the type of motorcycle you're on, whether anything from a touring bike to Project Livewire, the electric bike, and how different that was. But they're all those where when you dive into it, it's how do I interact with this, and really how do I feel while I'm on this motorcycle.
Yeah, and I have to imagine from a product development perspective, that's tricky. So putting my marketing hat back on for a second, I think a lot of what has always given a Harley its charisma are things that someone who rides a Honda might think are old or old-fashioned or primitive or kind of elemental. And I feel like Harley has had to tread pretty carefully around this over the last few years. I mean, I kind of see a narrative in the last 5 or 8 years of the company's product history whereby they're kind of walking this tightrope between being contemporary enough to stay in the game without sacrificing the Harley magic. So you look at the Streets, and then you look at the Rushmore initiative, and then Livewire, which I want to come back to, the introduction of the Milwaukee 8s, and then the Softails, and even yesterday with the FXDR 114. I mean, these feel like small steps, even though some of them are massively impressive. It has felt like a tightrope. Do you think that it has been for them? Do you think this carefulness is deliberate and that they're trying to protect something?
So the answer to that is yes. And although I don't know that, remember I'm a retiree for 3 years, and
right.
I don't represent Harley Davidson at all. But so the answer is yes, they're trying to protect something, and they're trying to protect that, that unique essence of Harley Davidson. And so, but I think we're seeing a change. Let me talk about earlier, and then I'll come to what I think about Harley Davidson today.
Sure.
So, Harley Davidson has been proven right in many areas. And, and I remember during the 80s, when the import brands, now people call them metric brands, talked about how outdated the V-twin engine was. And, and I remember, Harley being criticized, in ads from other manufacturers, talking about, V-twin engines and lack of power, and, the future is inline fours and things like that. And then, as the market goes on, it's like when you went into the 90s and 2000, look at this, everybody was coming back to V-twins and in some cases V4s. To me, it said, okay, well, there's an elemental the right shape of a motorcycle engine, and that V fits in there really well. And the feel that it gives is pretty awesome too. So and then along the way, Harley Davidson did some cool stuff like, the first electronic ignition on a motorcycle was Harley Davidson, and not the first, but adding anti-lock brakes. And there's a lot of innovations that Harley Davidson brought to the market that they don't really get credit for, because people who aren't in the know or really familiar with Harley Davidson don't realize that might have been an innovation that Harley Davidson already has or was incorporating. So so you take that technology piece, and Harley Davidson has been at various times through its history cautious about doing things that the customers may not like. The V-Rod is probably a great example of that.
Right.
And, so whether or not the Revolution engine from the V-Rod was going to be the future of, Harley Davidson, people in the marketplace will claim both ways, but that was it was beyond an experiment. It was creating a new product family that had some huge fans from the performance standpoint, and actually and huge fans from the customizing standpoint. In Europe, some of the finest customs I've ever seen were based on V-Rods. And so they just have done wonderful things over there. But from the standpoint of catching on to the point of driving the volume needed to maintain a family of motorcycles, it never caught on. Now, I don't know why, because it's a great motorcycle. And I think part of it was that the customers who would love that bike were ones who weren't customers who were considering Harley Davidson. So and I think that, so that's an example of a challenge that Harley Davidson has had throughout the years. Now, what we're seeing now, yesterday was the introduction of the 2019 Harleys, and we've seen over the past few weeks Harley Davidson's launch of their More Roads campaign, and saying, Harley Davidson is going to have a great presence in a variety of pieces of the market, where they previewed a prototype of an adventure bike, and they showed a Street Fighter, and they showed the current version of Livewire, and talked about those as future bikes. And what has to happen is that Harley Davidson, is demonstrating some pretty awesome knowledge in product development. And that, and I saw that when I was there, and Project Livewire, when I was working on it, was a great example of some really solid engineering, putting together a pretty amazing motorcycle. And they've continued to do that. Where Harley Davidson will be challenged going forward is they have to expand their family of people listening to their communication and in the consideration set for buying a Harley Davidson far beyond where it is today. And in addition, there has to be major inroads made into making motorcycling appealing to younger generations, which may not be nearly the type of risk takers that we saw in the 50s back from World War II, or that we see in, as current customers. So I think that I'm confident, and and I'll tell you this, the world is full of awesome motorcycles, and not just Harley Davidson, but there's a lot of manufacturers out there that make just superb bikes. And we as motorcyclists need to be aware that, we are a breed of people that there may not be a lot of people following us, and we need, help. Manufacturers and all of us maybe ought to be out there making sure that, we talk about how great motorcycling is and what a great experience it is to be on two wheels.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, I've got a question for you a little bit later on about young people in Harleys that maybe gives me some hope. But let's stick with this product development theme a little bit for a minute. So a couple of months ago, I had a chance to ride a Fat Bob kind of just around the block with the big Milwaukee 8. And I have to say, I thought it was stunning. I thought Harley Davidson was the last motorcycle I would ever have to worry about being careful with my right hand. And this thing was just, I think the word you used earlier was a beast, and I think it's appropriate. I was totally blown away by what a cool bike this was. I had no previous Harley experience, but it felt to me like a Harley should. So, okay, check. But now we've got the Pan America, and we have the Street Fighter, the family of Street Fighters. And these seem to me big, giant steps. I mean, from a marketing perspective, these might be the bravest things Harley's ever done. And you made reference to the V-Rod earlier as being, a story about maybe going a little, too far and people not getting it. I mean, these things seem kind of, off the charts in that regard. So I'm going to ask you a little bit unfairly maybe, but to speculate for me, how you think they made sure that Harley's DNA was in these bikes. So obviously, you can't speak about the actual development process, but I'm imagining meetings in which someone stands up and says, "Look, we can do this, this, and this, but this is non-negotiable." Like, I'm kind of curious to know how you think that might have gone.
So, well, and again, we're both speculating. Hey, before I go on, did you feel a little bit badass on that motorcycle?
Yeah, I really did. And except I'm not actually a badass guy, so this left me confused.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, during that around the block trip, you were badass, Bruce. Yeah. There's been, in my experience at Harley Davidson, and again, I'm not talking about, the work on the Pan America or the Street Fighter or the current, Project Livewire, is that, the drivers in product development are look, sound, and feel. And the feel piece of it oftentimes comes from that V-twin engine and the unique, signature vibration and sound that comes from that. And the company has spent a lot of time, on the sound of the motorcycle. And matter of fact, with Milwaukee 8, there was a strong effort to reduce mechanical noise, the sound of gears meshing and valves going up and down, so that they could increase the exhaust tone. Right. And and I think they did a nice job of achieving that. And, and then look, and the styling department as a rule, and I can't remember how many feet it was, but their rule right now is you have to be able to tell something is a Harley or something on a Harley is new or different from a certain distance. And, so it can't be, I'm 2 feet away, I'm looking and I notice something. It has to be noticeable from 10 or 15 or whatever feet away. So it has to be striking in that regard. And I think the other thing is there's a certain appreciation for shapes and curves that are part of Harley Davidson styling. And the example that I give is I look at, in some cases, let's just say a brake caliper. And if you look at many motorcycles, not all, but many motorcycles, whatever Brembo or Hayes or whatever, the company that produces brake calipers for that brand was going to do is what they put on the motorcycle. And Harley Davidson spends a ton of time with stylists reshaping mechanical pieces like that to make sure that they recognize both historical and current uses of shapes and curves and so forth. And so I think that, if we use the Pan America as an example, which I think I sent a text to a friend of mine in product development when I saw the video come out a few weeks ago talking about more roads to Harley Davidson. Mm-hmm. And I said, I love that ADV bike. When can I buy one? And he said, well, we'll look for you next year. And so I love that bike. And I love the fact that they've taken a motorcycle that, and I just had this discussion with a friend of mine when we were in South Dakota, that ADV bikes, with their big boxy bags on the back, I say, it feels like the manufacturers put so much effort into a cool styling on the front, some more than others, but if you look at the KTMs and some of the Yamaha bikes, it's like that fairing and is both functional and stylish, and the front of the bike is really styled. And then people put crappy looking boxes on the back that look like ammo boxes made out of aluminum.
Right.
And I said, what the industry, what if I were to buy one, I want one that's styled front to back. I want it to look cool, not just on the front and, on that, but I want that styling, the coolness to continue on through the back of the bike. And I think that, I saw that in the ADV bike from Harley. And even though we haven't seen bags yet, I suspect they're going to be a pretty good match for, the way the rest of the bike looks. And so I think the critical nature with anything you'll see from Harley is that is the unique packaging that people put into the bikes, and with the unique respect for the Harley curbs and, that goes along with the brand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I remember hearing a custom builder talk about how he was working on a Harley, and he talked about how the thing that mattered most was the line from the headstock to the rear axle, and it made me see Harleys in a whole new light. I think it was quite insightful, and that's what I actually wanted to ask you about. This will be. Super speculative, I guess, but I'm thinking about the custom scene. I know more than one person a young person who started out on a bike like a Bonneville, for example, and then ended up adding to the fleet a Harley or trading to a Harley. And this seems to have some connection to the custom scene's, new love for choppers and chopper-like bikes. So they're kind of, there's a drift away from the scramblers and cafes and more towards this, this style of bike, which, whether they are Harleys or not, you certainly evoke Harley Davidsons. I mean, it's, you think of when you see a chopper, you think of the Billy bike, and that was a Harley. And I look at that and I go, I wonder if this has been a windfall for Harley. I wonder if this has been a blessing for them in terms of the customer. You mentioned earlier the customer being, kind of in control sometimes, whether the customer is taking care of preserving its heritage. They could never have engineered this, but they must be happy about it. What do you think about that?
That's a great point, Bruce. I think that if you can look at things in the big picture like you're doing, then, you can say, very few people were customizing other brands of motorcycles in the 60s and, and 70s and things like that. And that the customizing craze that Harley Davidson owned, for many decades has now expanded into, some really cool bikes. There was a really cool BMW custom that was in a show that Michael Lichter coordinated at the Buffalo Chip Campground in Sturgis. And and who would ever think of a cool custom BMW in a chopper show?
Yeah.
But it was really neat. And so I think you're right. And if you can look at things in the big picture, I would say it may be less about Harley, but more about the experience of personal motorcycles has expanded far beyond Harley Davidson to Indian, who does a great job on the Scout bobber and things like that. But now the young people most engaged in motorcycling are those that are taking things off of bikes, whether they're metric or cruisers or Harley Davidson motorcycles, and making them personal. So I think the essence of customizing and personal motorcycles is being expanded. Not always with Harley Davidson, but I think you kind of have to give a nod that Harley Davidson was the brand that was first engaged in that.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I think it's pretty cool either way, and it's nice to hear that BMW was welcomed into the fold in Sturgis. So thinking a little bit about the future, I want to ask you about one project in particular that you worked on. You've mentioned a couple times, and that's Livewire, and about this idea of what makes a Harley a Harley. You were obviously out there on the line with ordinary consumers, ordinary riders, reacting to that bike. How did people react to a Harley that doesn't say potato, potato, potato?
So, which was really interesting, because that was one of the challenges that we faced as we launched it. And the background on this is our Harley Davidson's former CMO, my boss at the time, had called me in this was in 2012 actually, and asked me to start developing a consumer test ride experience on these prototype electric motorcycles. And at the time, he had said, we've just gotten board approval to have them manufacture 30 some electric bikes specifically for our use in offering test rides and getting consumer input to the future of a Harley Davidson electric motorcycle. And so we were developing that, and, as a brand statement about Harley Davidson, and to really reinforce the fact that Harley Davidson is a player when it comes to innovation. And so with that said, we needed to take a close look at the bike and our communication that went with it. And so the one thing we knew is when you get on that motorcycle, if I can get somebody to test ride it, there's nobody that comes back and said that sucked.
Right.
People come back and they go, that was awesome. They might say it's really different than anything I've ever ridden before. And 0 to 60, and I would always say 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, and the engineers would say 3.6 seconds. And so Corvette quality speed, and twist and go throttle, so you didn't have to shift, and something that you had a touch screen monitor that gave you what you needed to ride the bike, and you could focus on the ride, not doing the shifting and all the other stuff that we think we love about motorcycling, but maybe we don't. But we had to go through and say, okay, this is a great motorcycle, and we hope this is part of Harley Davidson's future, but how do you pull it into the family? How does it, you can't have this hanging out there as a black sheep.
Right.
And so what we as we did a close look, then we looked at styling. We said, okay, there is no other motorcycle that is styled, no other electric motorcycle, and in most cases, no other sport bike style motorcycle that was really styled like that, with that frame that hugged the battery box, and then the motor specifically down below. And you'll notice on Livewire, and I noticed from the images I saw from yesterday, the battery was black, because that's not the important part, but the motor was silver. The motor was silver, and was so that it would stand out to say, this is because we are a company, we at Harley Davidson are a company that focuses on, the motor is the essence of a motorcycle. So we're going to make sure that you see it, even though it's not in the typical place. And and then the other thing we spent a lot of time talking about was the sound. It's not potato, 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 but it's something different. And it's not sewing machine, and it's not, a whole lot of other things. But when you ride, and we were sitting there, and it was, when the bike was going on a test track, and we're talking about it, does kind of sound like a jet going past you.
I've heard that.
And, a jet taking off, a jet. And then the more we listened to it, the more we heard that essence in there. And so that was when we had that discussion, we said, that's a good descriptor for it. And then when we heard people say, well, that's not the sound of a Harley, my response was always, that's the sound of a new Harley.
Right.
And, and maybe we can't stereotype what the sound of a Harley Davidson is, because as the company grows and expands, there's going to be a reverence for that potato, 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 but there's going to be new sounds along the way. And, some of them may be higher revving, that sound a little bit different. Some of them may be classically cool, and some of them may be a lot like a jet engine.
And people accepted this. I guess having ridden it, people accepted this.
So and again, motorcycling is a holistic experience.
Right.
And those people that had a chance to take a ride on it and said, and a lot of people who said, I wasn't a big fan, but I decided to take a ride. And what happened was, I had such a good time riding the motorcycle that now I've embraced the sound, because the sound was part of that ride.
Huh.
And and I think that's where a lot of people will be. And when the bike comes out, like Harley Davidson just announced that they would be introducing it, I think next year,
right.
There will be a lot of people who will try their first electric motorcycle, and they will be going, holy cow, is this ever cool?
Yeah. I bet that's right. And, this is probably super too dorky for most people who will walk into a Harley dealership, but it strikes me that the sound is one thing that Harley kind of owns, but torque is another thing, and electric bikes have that all covered. And I bet that was the case with Livewire too. So,
yes.
It can't be a secret to you that in online forums in particular, and so therefore probably on the street, there's this group of people with a sort of weirdly intense antipathy towards the brand. And I look at that, with my marketing hat on, and I say, well, okay, that's good. Harley has a dominant market share, and yet it's still capable of eliciting intense emotion. That's a pretty neat trick. But I think that kind of thing would make a lot of brands uncomfortable. And I have certainly worked for marketers who would have been scared, up into a tree by that kind of intensity. I'm curious if you can say, what do the haters mean to Harley?
So it's really interesting you bring that comparison up, because I have other clients that are extremely sensitive to, negative comments or trolls on the internet, things like that. And, but in the specific to Harley Davidson, there are those people who love other types of motorcycles, and, whether they're ADV bikes today or sport bikes, or everybody has their own life, and everybody has their own things that they like to do. And, and there's a lot of different ways to appreciate motorcycling. So, and I'll use, for my, I love riding sport bikes, but I don't own one. But one could take the approach, with a sport bike, but why would someone need a motorcycle that goes that fast? Why possibly could someone want a 200-mile-an-hour motorcycle when speed limits don't even come close to that? And so some might, so a person who was adamant that that was just a wrong way to think might become let's call him a hater of the bikes and perhaps the people who ride them. But I think for most people, there's an appreciation that, it's, even if you never make 200 miles an hour, it's fun to ride that type of motorcycle.
Right.
Another thing area that I was thinking about is the motorcycle cannonball is coming up in September. And that's a ride of vintage, pre-1920s motorcycles, across from, Portland, Washington to Portland, Maine. And, one could say, why would somebody ride that old a motorcycle when there's all these great current model motorcycles that you could do it on? But it's a different way to show your passion. Okay. So I think about, the people who don't have a broad enough perspective to understand how people are different and how people enjoy different things. So, I think Harley Davidson has benefited, at least in the past couple of decades, from being a dominant brand and being able to survive while some people are not, adamant promoters or maybe adamant detractors. But when I think that, the reasoning, I don't know that Harley Davidson understands, or me personally understand why someone becomes a hater or an adamant detractor
right.
from a style of riding motorcycles. And is it because they don't like the bikes? Well, there's other bikes out there. Is it they don't like the people? Well, there's a lot of great people, and maybe they haven't been exposed to the right ones riding Harleys or cruisers or whatever. So I think from a brand standpoint, you would love for everybody to love your brand, but that's not possible. And I think Harley Davidson will make the most of and continue to make the most of an extremely loyal following. And a following that includes people who buy and ride the bikes and other people who are just fans of the brand.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think there's a certain amount of courage in that point of view. I mean, I look at the size of that business, and I think probably Harley's market share above 650 cc's must surely still be in the mid 40s. That's kind of Tide and Crest and McDonald and Coke territory. And normally when brands get to that size, they don't tend to get people wound up anymore. And this one does. So I kind of think that's cool. And your answer is probably the right answer. You could probably tell that I'm sort of in the camp that's cheering Harley on through this process of reinvention. I'm not a Harley owner, yet, and maybe I never will be. Hard to tell what the future holds, but I love that Harley Davidson is in the world. If you could imagine a world in which there were no Harley Davidson, I think there'd be a giant hole in the soul of motorcycle culture, if I can put it that way. That's the kind of podcast this is. So, assuming that you agree that's true, assuming you agree that's true,
yes, I do.
What do you think exactly would be missing?
So, I think that there's. Where I find so many other brands live is the celebration of the technology of motorcycling on two wheels. And what Harley Davidson filled in the gap with was a celebration of the people and the relationships that are generated by those who love riding on two wheels. And so I think I said earlier, there are so many great motorcycles in the world, and the need for great bikes isn't necessarily out there. Bikes will continue to get better, but you know what? We have a lot of great bikes right now, and brands need to engage more deeply with the people that ride them, and not just Harley Davidson, but I think, we see it a little bit on the Honda side because they're the Goldwing Road Riders and the Goldwing organizations are tremendously, we all ride, but they celebrate the fact that they ride a single brand. BMW has that. And there's other brands that know how to celebrate the hardware, but don't know how to celebrate the software or the people piece of the sport. And I think that's a gap that Harley Davidson filled early on. And that might be something that allowed Harley Davidson to survive through, 70s, 80s, 90s type time period when, maybe the bikes, weren't what they should have been. And and I think we could all of us as riders, and I tend to see that a little bit happening more now, that as riders, we tend to engage a little bit less by brand and a little bit more by the fact that we're excited to be surrounded by other riders, no matter what they're riding.
Yeah, I think that's true. So speaking of, when you announced your retirement 3 years ago, I recall that you told one blogger that you had, among other great things in your life, you had a brand new motorcycle in the garage. What are you riding?
So I'm blessed with the ability to have a couple of motorcycles, both Harleys, and the ones that match my style of riding tend to be touring bikes in Wisconsin, where I do most of my riding. I have a 2018 CVO Limited. So, a big touring bike with about every accessory, built into it that you can possibly imagine.
Right.
And my wife and I have a place in Arizona that we spend a little bit of time during the year at, and family in that part of the country. And there I have a Street Glide, which works perfectly for hanging out with my motorcycle friends down there and hitting some of the events that I love to go to in the Southwest. So those are my two current bikes, although I just saw the 2019 Harley lineup come out, and there's some enticing stuff in there. And I am confident that in a couple of years, when Livewire makes it to the streets, there's going to be an electric bike in my garage too.
Yeah, you and probably a lot of people. Although I got to say that Street Fighter, I keep looking at it like a dirty picture. But that's me.
Yeah, isn't it cool? And I will tell you, look at the lines on that, and look at, that. I can't wait to see one in person because looking at the beautiful lines in that, and then the additions that they made stylistically and perhaps functionally to the motor. And it's like, that one is really interesting to me. And just from a beautiful motorcycle standpoint.
Yeah, I think that one could be a sleeper. So I guess just kind of one more question, because it seems like once you get motorcycles in your blood, you never get it out. It turns out that you're not really retired at all, are you? You didn't waste any time finding other ways to keep irons in the fire with the community, and you've got a couple things going on, right?
So I'm blessed with a great opportunity that retirement meant for me, and I have spent a bunch of time with family and now 4 grandkids that are spread throughout the country.
Oh, wow.
And also, when I retired, the intent was really to find some projects with friends and business associates that would allow me to stretch my wings into new areas, new problems. And I have been doing consulting with several clients in and outside the motorcycle industry, and a couple of startups, which is really fascinating to go through life working with a startup company. I have a couple of established companies within the motorcycle industry, the aftermarket, that I've been helping with. And the work is some communication, some strategy, some support for leaders, and helping them be the best leaders they can be. And I found that it's just a personal challenge from the standpoint of it engages me so much that it just pulls me right in. And so I think I said earlier, I count my blessings every day because I've got this great experience that I had with a wonderful brand for 35 years, and now the ability to, extend my knowledge to help friends and to help other companies that, that I can be support to.
That's inspiring. It's because that rebel spirit continues to beat on, eh?
Well, that's what I try to bring into some of the partner companies that aren't feeling it. And it's like, you got to stretch. You got to try to be more than what you think you can be. And, because that's a piece of what brought Harley Davidson to where it is today.
Yeah, it sure did. Heck of a story. And you were there for all the best parts, it seems to me. Steve, I just can't tell you how grateful I am for the time you've given me. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but I guess we should leave it there. Thanks again so much, and hope we'll see you out there somewhere.
All right. I hope so, too. It was great chatting with you. Thanks for allowing me to kind of tell my stories and to share them with your audience. And, anytime you want to pick it up again, either this way or on at some roadside stand where we have a cup of coffee and then do a little bit of riding before and after, that would be great.
That sounds awesome. That sounds awesome. Okay, man. Well, I'll let you go, and thanks again. Ride safe.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Bruce. Great talking to you.
Bye now. When I was in grade 7, I was not the most attentive student, and one of the ways I passed the time I would otherwise have wasted on math was drawing motorcycles. These bikes came mostly from my imagination, since motorcycles were something of a rarity where I grew up, and I knew nothing about how they worked. Yet all those bikes I drew followed a pattern. They were long and low, with raked-out forks and beefy rear tires, and flamboyant exhaust systems, and an air of menace. And in the middle, somewhere under the gas tank, was always the same vague sketch of an engine. A bunch of parallel lines on the left slanting upward, and a matching bunch of parallel lines on the right slanting downward, all anchored by a chrome lump at the bottom. I didn't know these were cooling fins, or that I was drawing a 45-degree V-twin engine. I just thought this is what a motorcycle looked like. Motorcycles whispered to me for a long time before I finally got the message and did something about it. And I think that's true for a lot of us, if the emails I get from listeners are any indication. And the voice they whispered in to me was most often the lumpy, barely awake idle of a big twin engine patiently waiting to go somewhere. Well, I was not destined to be a Harley owner, as it turns out, or not so far anyway. If I'm honest, they just feel like too big a statement for my personality. And besides, decades of cycling has made it impossible for me to get comfortable with my feet in front of me. Listen to me making excuses. Anyway, the bikes in my barn look pretty different from the ones I grew in my grade 7 math notebook. But if you asked me to draw you one today, it might look very much the same as those adolescent doodles. Long and low, with raked-out forks and a flamboyant exhaust, all wrapped around that 45-degree V-twin. Not because that's necessarily what a motorcycle looks like, but because for a lot of people in this world, that's what freedom looks like. However you feel about Harley Davidson, you can't deny that this has been its gift to the world of motorcycling. This brand has built a kind of bridge between our culture and the rest of humanity, a universal symbol of how it feels to do what we do. Well, thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com, and that's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions. Every email gets an answer. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I like to post pictures of bikes I find on the street. And Harley pictures, I should add, are always the ones that get the most likes. For this episode's playlist recommendation, there was no end of iconic tracks that made me think of Harley Davidson motorcycles. But in a sea of Steppenwolf and Springsteen, this one stood out, and it nails it for me. The song is called Unknown Legend, originally written and performed by Neil Young. This version is by a young country singer named Megan Patrick, who comes from Bowmanville, Ontario, just east of Toronto. I chose it for that girl on the Harley, the one who somehow ended up in the New York Times, and reminded us all never to take life on two wheels for granted. You can buy it wherever you like to get your music, and in the meantime, keep staying alive out there.